University education seemed not to give any benefit. Now, again, this is like income. To the extent that it has enabled people to get better jobs, it probably does have some benefit. But when you adjust for those, the benefit is pretty much zero. What about lack of trust? The statement, I can trust many or most people locally. Those who disagreed with that had about 5% lower quality of life. And this was very marked in Sydney. It was more like 11%. So I don't know yet why that might be. People with who have views about the go-getting attitudes and greater markets in Sydney may have something to say about that. Okay, that was using British scoring. What about the Australian scoring? Finally got this about 5 days ago, and it doesn't look that different from the UK. These are the values of the average Australian. Now, of course, the average Australian might not exist, but leaving that aside for the moment, the pattern across the 5 dimensions is really quite similar to the average British older person. The only difference is that they seem to emphasize more, be more bothered about attachment. And this is largely an age effect. These are Australians of any adult age. The British sample were people aged 65 and over. And we tend to find that older people worry more about loss of independence due to the effects that poor health are likely to have. So the fact we have a younger sample here is largely responsible for this slightly larger emphasis on attachment. So having none of the love and friendship you want is the worst thing. It's not having no independence is the worst thing. So applying these scores, these norms, to the tick box answers doesn't really change the picture that much. But is there such a thing as the average Aussie? Going back to another Monty Python film, the best one, Life of Brian, when he's trying to get the crowds to think like individuals and say, yes, you're all different. Yes, we're all different. And then the guy cries out, I'm not. He's our average person, and there isn't really an average person, it turns out. We've averaged over apples and oranges. There are actually at least three Australian types. We're still collecting data here. The final story, I'm sure there'll be more, but I think these are broad categories which I think are fairly robust. There's young people looking for love. They have an extreme version of the last but one slide. It's all about relationships. People in middle age are not so bothered about that. They seem to be more worried about security and control, independence, but particularly security. So I think they're worried about not being the no worries Aussie. Worries to them are particularly dreadful. And then the old people are much more worried about independence. We saw this in the British data as well. And there are also some suggestions of a marital effect here as well, that once you lose a partner for whatever reason, you're much more bothered about independence, partly probably because you've actually regained some independence and it assumes greater importance for you. The one instance where that was not the case in the UK data were widowers. Widows were really bothered about loss of independence, probably because there's no longer someone to look after them if they get poorly. If they lose their health, they've got to go into residential care, which they universally loathe the idea of. The widowers were much more like their married counterparts. They were still worried about being lonely, probably because British older people rely on their wives for the social networks. Doris talking over the hedge to Vera next door sort of thing. But I wonder if there's an effect here too. So what happens then when we use the scores, the norms, applicable to a more relevant group? We're no longer applying the values of some average Australian or average Brit, but we apply the scores that are applicable to our age group. Well, Sydney does even better if you're childless, which was interesting, and even worse if you don't have them. So the effect here has been magnified. Interestingly, being widowed isn't so bad, and I know why this is going on, because people who are widowed are typically older, therefore they are more worried about loss of independence. So losing a partner, although clearly was bad for them in terms of quality of life, it didn't have such an enormous weight that it had applied to it when we used these average scores. The income effect was very similar. And the higher education effect, again, was non-existent, if anything, the opposite. And I wondered if there is a student debt effect being picked up here. I don't know. We need to look at that in more detail. Poor health and poor sleep was even worse if you use our own values, probably because the groups who are most vulnerable to this are the older people. They're worried about loss of independence, so people who are in poor health have got a lower score using these new scores that have a very, very low value for the bottom categories of independence. With regard to the social empowerment variables, no changes. So, where are we going with this then? Well, I said we're still recruiting for the survey where we're finding out the types. So the choice experiment that we're doing, Pure Profile, I've got it in field at the moment. We're still building up the sample sizes in order for us to get scores for both instruments. I've talked entirely about IceCap-O so far because it was the only instrument we had available last year. We've now got IceCap-A and it's in field. But just eyeballing the results we have so far, I don't expect any major problems. The concern we had was that IceCap-O was developed for older people. Are we asking the right questions to young, if we're administering it to young people? Well, I think we're not going to go too far wrong. The conceptual dimensions are essentially the same. We've changed the wording of the security one and the role one, but we're capturing the same sort of concepts. So we'd like to look more to see what are the Australian types. And as I say, the suggestion from what I've seen so far is that we can probably get a more nuanced view of these 3 Australian types. There are probably subgroups within those that will give us a richer idea of what Australians value. So far, these seem to be related to age and marital status, but they almost certainly are related to other things as well. Most notably, your own experience. What about lonely people? Are they really bothered about, is loneliness the worst thing that they can envisage? Maybe they try to compensate on one of the other dimensions, and the idea of losing their independence is the worst thing to them. We can test that, because we've got people's tick box answers and see if lonely people have got different values from people who are not lonely. We want to administer both instruments in surveys and trials. IceCap-O has already been administered in at least one survey in another unnamed Australian state. I'm not at liberty, unfortunately, to divulge which at the moment, but we've got additional data from that, which has enabled us to kind of cross-reference with the Pure Profile data. Longitudinal data is our real holy grail that we want here. The values we've got from the middle-aged and the older people may not be the same ones that I have when I get to that age. Seeing how people's quality of life changes over time will be important. Seeing how their values, their norms change over time will be important to see and to make predictions for the future about what people value. Because if governments want to provide the services that provide the most benefit to people, and if companies want to provide the goods and services that people want most, that we need to have a good idea of how these things change over time. Ultimately, what I'd like to have is for everyone to have a personalized scale. I've put up charts with average values. Ultimately, and this is the real draw for people in the survey, that they tend not to be that keen about answering choice experiments unless they're explained to them what the purpose of it is. They're inclined to say, these all look the same, these questions. And you have to stress to them that no, this is why it's important. We're seeing what trade-offs you're making, how your answers are switching when we start switching the amounts. And if people do that, we can give everyone their own, ultimately, personalized scale. All these impairments are on there. They could post it, I don't know, onto Facebook, make comparisons with their peers and friends. So we could say who you're like, who you're unlike, and relate it to people's own characteristics or not, as the case may be. And I think that'll be a real draw for people. And these values, they come from a choice experiment. They represent frequencies, how often we've picked something. We know what the mathematical properties of these scores are. Just to round off with what else I and colleagues are doing in this area, one of my PhD students developed a measure for carers of older people in the UK. Carers are increasingly being relied upon in industrialized countries with aging populations, and they often have a pretty poor experience when they're having to be on call 24/7 for an aged parent or a spouse. And the experience that they have is something which is neglected in many health economic evaluations. So my PhD student developed an instrument for them. It's a 6-item instrument. We've got UK scoring for that, again, coming from a best-worst choice model, and it would be great to repeat that in Australia. I'm involved with a study of getting scoring for a kids' quality of life measure in Adelaide, and we're hoping to get funding from the NHMRC to do that. I'm involved with a big project in the UK to value social care-related quality of life. That's quite similar to the work we've done with the ICECAP. And some collaborators at University of Western Australia are using best-worst methods to score a personality questionnaire, the Schwarz's list of values, which I think will be quite useful in time in helping us understand differences in the norms in terms of quality of life amongst Australians. I'd just like to thank you all for listening, and I'd like to thank all my collaborators, particularly Jordan Louviere and Joe Coast, who've led up the work in the quantitative and qualitative side. Pure Profile for making a lot of these surveys possible and for really wanting to take this to the next level. And various researchers have helped me with the analysis and with putting it together, and my project manager, Gail, and people at Bristol City Council. And thank you for listening.